Hi, I'm Bren Diggins and welcome to Readers React. Today I'm going to be talking about Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi and I'm excited to dive in. I want to look at the bottom of page 208 and the top of page 209. So in order for you to understand what text we're looking at, I'm going to have you pause the video here to read these three paragraphs, and then when you're done, you can unpause the video. You read it? Great. Here's another page. This is the top of the next page, so you can pause again to read these three short paragraphs, and then when you're done, you can unpause the video. Perfect. Now let's jump into talking about the text. This is part of Willie's chapter, and Willie and her husband Carson move from the south to the north in this chapter, and they arrive in New York City looking for work. Part of this chapter is about them trying to establish their lives, and something that's important to note and really good context for this passage is that Willie is very dark-skinned and Carson, her husband, is very light-skinned. So when they arrive in the north, they discover that the difference in their skin color makes a huge impact on how people interact with them as individuals and also them as a couple. So reading through this passage, something that jumped out at me right away was then the two of them would walk out into Harlem to look for work, Robert in his fancy clothes and Willie in his plain ones. This passage beginning in this way already sets up that there's a dichotomy between Robert and Willie. It seems like Robert is dressing up, whereas Willie is dressing down, and that can be related to the differences in the ways that their skin color influences what jobs they are deemed like appropriate for. They also talk about or Willie reflects on how they no longer walk together on the sidewalk. Robert always walks a little ahead of her, and they never touched. And she says even if she was falling into the street or a man was robbing her or a car was coming at her, she knew not to call his name. She did it once, and Robert had turned and everyone had stared. I want to highlight two things about this reflection. The first is that these are pretty extreme circumstances, right? If someone is falling into the street and might get hit by a car, or someone's being robbed, or again, about to be hit by a car, that's a time when you would want to call out for help, especially if your husband is right there. But she feels that there's a huge stigma against her and her husband because they look so different, and interracial couples were not accepted at this time. And even though Carson is a black man, because he can pass as white, he is doing that in New York City, and people are assuming that he's white on first glance. And I think the interesting thing too is that everyone had stared, and those stares felt, we don't really know exactly how they felt, but I imagine that they felt, menacing and judging, because it's such an intense stare that Willie's not willing to go through that scrutiny again, even if something extreme like being hit by a car or being robbed is about to happen to her. So I think that this really sets up the stakes of their social interactions in this passage. The next part of the passage speaks to how the division between Robert and Willie is mapped onto the city and determined by the city's structure, especially its social structure. So one thing I kind of wanted to point out here is that they go searching for jobs again, and they sort of have had this realization as a couple that Willie needs to look for jobs in black neighborhoods and black businesses, and Robert is going to look for work in the whiter areas of New York City because he doesn't want to be having these situations where he's being judged, and it's easier in some senses for him to pass and assimilate into the white structures. Willie talks about how when they split off in their search for work, she lost Robert to the rest of Manhattan, and he looks so white now it only took a few seconds for him to lose him completely. Just one white face among the many, all bustling up and down the sidewalks. And I think that this is really interesting because in my mind it paints a picture of there literally being one street maybe that divides her neighborhood from the rest of Manhattan, the rest of white Manhattan, and she loses him among the crowd. And that is also striking because there must be just so many people who all look the same, all the white people living in Manhattan, that he just seamlessly blends into them, and there's just kind of a mass of people. Whereas I'm sure if you looked on the opposite way, it would be just a mass of Black people. So I think that this divide is really set up, and Willie kind of hammers this home a little bit more when she talks about how there is a Black family that she is going to be the housekeeper for. They're a wealthy Black family, so they're trying to live on the southern edge of Harlem, and she says the family had not yet resigned themselves to their own Blackness, so they crept as close to the white folks as the city would allow. They could go no further, their skin too dark to get an apartment just one street down. And I think that this example, again, takes the point of there is this clear divide between where the white people live and where the Black people live, and there's a strict enforcement of that boundary as well, because it has to do with housing and with where people are willing to live and who they're willing to live with, and what structures are set up in place to prevent those people from crossing those arbitrary and racist borders that are set up within the city. This passage got me really interested in looking into what are some of the ways that this separation between the Black and white communities were created, how were they built up and reinforced. And one way I could do this was by looking at some maps and some historical data about the process of redlining and how it impacted and perpetuated segregation. So to start, here's a map of New York City, and the areas that we're looking at in particular, this first arrow is pointing to Harlem and East Harlem. Then there's Central Park and the Upper West Side and Upper East Side, which are kind of the other parts of Manhattan. And so this really helped me visualize what Willie was talking about when the Black family that she works for as a housekeeper tried to move as far south as possible. So you can see Harlem is right there, a little bit northern of these kind of elite parts of Manhattan. And it makes sense that they were trying to move down closer to them if they wanted to be part of that elite community. So redlining is the process of drawing boundaries around neighborhoods based on residents' race and depriving them of resources and opportunities, effectively racializing poverty in cities across the U.S. To give some more context to what redlining is, it kind of got started with the 1930s and the Great Depression, when that was impacting lots of people's abilities to continue to afford their homes. And the government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And in order to give out these loans, they did surveys of all the neighborhoods, and they had criteria for what homes the loans would guarantee. And this criteria was racist. They did look at the types of housing that they would be giving loans for, but more importantly, they were looking at the people who lived there and the people who lived in those neighborhoods. So they talk about there were different classifications that they made for the neighborhoods. So best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. And I put Harlem there because, as we'll see in a minute looking at the maps, they were one of the hazardous areas. And how that was determined was not by health hazards or likelihood of natural events or disasters. It was really determined by the people who were living there. So they saw Black people as detrimental influences, and especially if there were also mixed races that took the neighborhood down in the eyes of the homeowners loan corporation. And basically it just lowered the overall value of that neighborhood. You couldn't get a loan for a home in those areas, which then really exacerbated and perpetuated cycles of poverty in these areas and made them under-resourced and underserved, which continues to have an impact today. So these maps are from the New York City Department of Health, and this map shows all the different neighborhoods that were classified in those different categories that I mentioned that the Homeowners Loan Corporation set up. So here, that's all red, would be Harlem. And then here in Class A, that's the part of Manhattan that Carson in Homegoing is going to look for work in. And you can see that all the areas where people of color would be living in, especially Black people in Harlem, were automatically Class D hazardous, even though there's not really any reason for that besides Black people living there. I think something else that was really interesting to see is this second map shows the different districts, and then as well the percent of people still today living in poverty in those neighborhoods. So I'm going to click into this, and you can see Community District 110, 99.25% of the residential area was redlined, and now 27.2% of its residents live in poverty. And then Community District 111, 98.4% of the residential area was redlined, and now 34.3% of its residents live in poverty. So these two districts are Central Harlem and East Harlem. Here we have the Upper East and West Sides, 10% and 6.2% of those communities are living in poverty, which is a huge difference between 27 and 34%. So you can see that because of the redlining and making these neighborhoods segregated, and therefore also denying them resources and economic opportunity to continue to grow their neighborhoods and to access resources and financial supports, they perpetuated cycles of poverty in those neighborhoods, whereas the other ones did not see such a dramatic retention of poverty in those areas. Seeing those maps and how the actions of the past have an impact on the present really made the experience of Homegoing's characters, Willie and Carson, that much more rich to me. But I also think that without seeing and reading the experience of Willie and Carson, I wouldn't have an understanding of what it was like for people living in those communities at that time who were experiencing that segregation. I wouldn't know what they felt when they saw that division like across the street and the the masses of white people versus the masses of Black people. And especially for Carson, what a tricky and complicated situation as a light-skinned Black man being able to pass into those other communities without being stigmatized, but always kind of in fear of being discovered, and knowing that he has a dark-skinned wife and how complicated that made their relationship. So I think that this exercise of really zeroing in on something that stood out to me in the text and then finding out more information just made the importance of reading the story of Homegoing that much richer. And I wonder how much research the author must have gone through to create this text. It's such a rich story, and this is just one teeny tiny slice of it, but I think knowing this story brings my knowledge of the history of that period to a greater level, because I have a human understanding of what people living in these communities might have experienced during that time. And it really puts some feelings and emotions towards those maps that are already, pretty powerful, but I do think that they do miss the opportunity to learn from individuals and their experiences, and that's why we have novels. If you haven't read Homegoing yet, I super recommend it. It's a great read. It's very interesting. There's so much to learn here and so many different ways you could bring your research of history into this novel if that's something that interests you. I hope that you'll pick it up and tune in next time for another Readers React. Thank you.